moment when you try to share and you hope it all works. And let's see if we can find it. Okay. I've got my my colleague Sam is on the call, and she's always very helpful at telling me whether she can see what's going on and whether that makes any sense, whether you can hear me. The fear is always when you're doing these sessions that you're sitting here chatting away, then you realise that you've disconnected and nobody can hear anything you're saying. So let me just try and go to presentation.
We can
So
see the
Sam,
presentation.
fantastic. Let's hope it keeps working. So welcome everyone. This is a short session about storytelling and its role in communication and engagement. So there's lots of different reasons that we tell stories, and we do it all the time, even though we're not really aware of it. But when we are aware of the power of storytelling, we can actually use it in lots of different ways. I'm going to carry on through the presentation, and then hopefully there'll be time at the end that I can talk to you individually a bit more if you want to do that, if you're happy to do that. But I'm just going to carry on through the slides and we'll see how we go. Okay, so I'm starting with heading of Tales of the Unexpected. One of the best ways to capture people's attention is to say something at the beginning of a story that's a little bit unusual so that it sticks in people's minds and catches their attention. On the sort of description of the session, I talked about some of the countries that I've visited across the world. And I have amazing stories. And I wish there were just sessions every week around storytelling where people could just come together at lunchtime and just share their stories, because I think that would be brilliant, not only for understanding more about the world, but actually helping with our mental health as well, because it's one of the important parts of sharing our stories and having people understand the things that we're doing, the things that we've experienced. So I just wanted to pick a few types of opening lines from stories. And I don't know if you might know these. It might be something you've read and stuck in your mind or not. So when a day that you happen to know is Wednesday starts off by sounding like a Sunday, there's something seriously wrong somewhere. And those of you that recognise that knows what's happening, because that's the opening lines from the day, the Triffids, and something was definitely wrong somewhere. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Another classic opening. And again, we already think something's a bit odd, something's up, because obviously why the clock striking 13? And that's George Orwell's 1984. Here's another one. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Really classic opening lines from A Tale of Two Cities. And it does a bit of a clever storytelling trick that when we say storytelling, I don't know what that evokes in your head immediately, but it is so many different forms of media, including, of course, films. Today, now we have films, about sometimes where we don't start at the beginning of the story, we start at the end, and then we find out how we got there. Or sometimes now, films especially, it's much harder to follow in books, but there is moving about in time in films where it starts in a point of time, but it goes backwards and forwards. So the wonderful thing about telling a story is you don't have to be specific where you are in the world, where you are in the universe, or where you are in time. And here's another classic opening line that you might be familiar with. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away is that scrolling script at the beginning of Star Wars. And it's a bit of a classic line, isn't it? Because fairy tales start in a very similar way. Okay, so communication and engagement, that's the focus of this session around storytelling. As I say, there are lots of different ways to look at storytelling, but in the time that we've got, I'm just going to take you through a very sort of framework of storytelling, and hopefully you might pick up some ideas for yourselves if your job is in communication or engagement, or just day to day, or when you're listening to somebody else telling a story. And there's a few quotes here. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So sometimes we think we've put information out there, what we've done is communicated. But in fact, what we've done is just put information out and nobody has received it. There's another one I really like here for where we are at the moment with social media. If a tree falls over in the forest and no one mentions it on Facebook, did it really happen? Great communication begins with connection, and it's about that connection that's the really important part that I want to try and focus on as we go through this. To effectively communicate, we must realize that we are all different in the way we perceive the world, and use this understanding as a guide to our communication with others. So we might tell a story that we think is really captivating, but the audience has no interest in it. And the real art of storytelling is recognizing your audience. Now, just normally day to day when we share our stories, that's not important. We just want to get it off our chest. We just want to share it with somebody and have somebody else know what a bad day we've had, what a good day we've had, where we are. It makes us feel better. But when it comes to communication and engagement for a purpose, we need to think about the different worlds people actually live in. So a little bit of history. I've put the words on here so that if the slides go out, you can actually read through this afterwards, because it isn't easy, as we know, to just listen to facts told directly to you and retain those. And that's something else we'll think about in storytelling. But in this day and age, having social media account means you have access to see everyone's life without actually being there, which is a really interesting concept. And we could spend a whole day thinking about social media and how that affects us. The internet has created a space for blogs, posting pictures, and events that you attend. Social media has become the modern way we tell stories of our lives. In the 21st century, social media is a time capsule for all humankind. Because we say it in a moment, but what's interesting is it's there for much longer than that. And people who say something that they regret understand that stories can travel a really long way, have a really massive impact, and hang around for a long time. The evolution of storytelling reflects how people learn and communicate. Through oral storytelling or written storytelling, the voice of the narrator will always have a place and purpose. Although mediums have changed, the core concept of using a sequence of events in an exciting narrative has remained the same. And when you are vocally or orally telling a story, how you tell it is just as important as what you're saying. And if you're reading something, emphasis, pauses, spaces in between are all really important. You can read it in different styles. So if I read, in the mountains of southern France are caves with drawings dating back to 30,000 years. On the walls of the cave, explorers found paintings depicting the prehistoric period. Stories told in an unspoken, unwritten language about encountering on mammoths, lions, and rhinos. Hopefully, that doesn't sound as interesting as the ancient Greeks discovered ways to use their agricultural tools to carve messages onto stone and slate. But for thousands of years, their stories were communicated only through oral storytelling. Slowly, as the Greeks developed writing, they applied it to storytelling and wrote poems. Most of their communication were in times of sorrow, war, and celebration. How you transmit the story is just as important as the story. I'm not going to read all of these different bits because you may have had time to read them, but I just think one of the things that really fascinates me are fairy stories and our interest in those fairy stories. And not too long after the era of Shakespeare, stories that we call fairy stories now started to arrive into England from France and the rest of Europe. And if you're aware of fairy stories, Hansel and Gretel, for instance, some of them are quite scary and actually immediately give us an insight into different cultures, because some fairy stories can be quite strange when you read them. And as I say, we haven't got time to delve into all the different parts of storytelling. But if you've got a chance, have a look at some stories online. And, some pretty gruesome things went on in those stories, but they did have a purpose. So stories come from all around the world. Storytelling is universal as it is ancient. It occurs in every culture, from every age. It exists and existed to entertain, to inform, and to propagate cultural traditions and values. Oral storytelling is through the voice and gestures. Now, you can't see me gesturing. If I turn my camera on, I'll probably lose you completely. But something that has become really popular, and I suppose has been very popular through things like The Archers, are blogs and vlogs, but also podcasts. So we had radio, and then we had television, and we had all the images. And actually, podcasts where you just hear the person's voice have become very popular once again. So that oral tradition of storytelling without any other images or gestures or body language is actually finding a place in the storytelling of today. There's a couple of examples from around the world here, like all Native American tribes, the Choctaw have an oral storytelling tradition going back generations. Now, what is very common in storytelling, similar to Aesop's fables, is that they often use animals to tell stories and to depict characters. And I think that's probably about being kind to people. So rather than picking out a human trait, stories are told through animal characters. And that still happens a lot now. And we see that in films today and stories today. But it's interesting that it happened all around the world. And Anna Semi, not very good with some of these pronunciation, apologies for that, was a set of stories about a cunning spider who sets out to outsmart all of those around him. And really, they're stories of humanity being told through these animal characters. Very interesting that, as I say, it happens all around the world. So why do we still tell stories today? Why do I tell stories? Because I do like to tell a story and I love to hear a story as well. So tell me a story, something we have all said or heard in our lives. Stories can travel huge distances, move through time, create new worlds, or allow you to explore dangerous places from the safety of your own home. But more than anything, stories can bring us together around the campfire. Not always a real campfire, although that would be nice, around a campfire in our imaginations. And there you have it. I'm telling you the end of the story before the story has even begun. Storytelling is a key to your imagination, your empathy, your emotions, your soul. A good story reaches out and invites you in further and further until all that exists for the time that the world swirl around you is the story. And after the story, you are richer for it. Whether it made you cry or smile, a new experience will have taken up residence in your being. We can escape into the rich and inviting words of our favourite authors. In a thrilling tale of adventure, or any of the stories I chose on the opening lines in the Tales of the Unexpected slide. All those stories can relay lessons from the past and warnings for the future. They can also be a method for us all to portray our dreams of what the future may hold, or allow introspection on what has occurred in the past. Through stories, we often scare children with tales of monsters. Why do they love that so much? Stories give them heroes in which they can aspire, having adventurous journeys in distant lands. Children need these heroes, for heroes are a positive influence on their lives, a template from which they can learn to grow and develop. Stories also teach us how to and allow them to practice using their imaginations. These lessons are important for the development of children, but also really important for the development of adults, for all of us, to keep learning, keep growing, keep seeing into other people's lives, making those connections, understanding that other people's worlds are different to ours. Stories offer archetypal role models for us to emulate, but they also can show us the dark side of humanity for us to choose to abandon. Some of the most important stories we listen to are those that help us understand other people's lives, their point of view, their needs, wants, fears, and hopes. My mum was a writer, and although she's no longer here, I read her stories and I enter a world she created. I can spend time with her there. And that's why I wanted to write stories and tell stories, because they are a wonderful gift that we can both give and receive. I'm a storyteller at heart. I feel it's my purpose, my destiny, perhaps. I mostly write for myself, but I do tell children's stories as part of my Little Green Champions sessions. And maybe if we've got time, I'll tell you one of those at the end of the session. So when we were thinking about the project, which is the Future Parks project in Birmingham called Naturally Birmingham, we wanted to find out what people thought about green spaces. We wanted to find out, did they like them? Did they not like them? If they didn't like them, why didn't they like them? What could we change? And in that very core of storytelling, we asked them to do two things. We asked them to return to an earlier point in their life and tell us some memories of green spaces. And we asked them to think about the future. What do we need to stop doing? What do we need to do more of? What do they want to see more of? What do they want to see less of? And help us shape the vision for a city of nature for Birmingham. And we've received around 200 stories back. Some of them are a couple of lines long. Some of them are a page long. Some of them are poems. We have stories from children told through pictures. But as we've said, one of the oldest methods of transmitting information or communicating is storytelling, or what is often referred to as word of mouth. Today, opportunities for storytelling can be organised as engagement or consultation methods, physical storytelling sessions that are recorded, online sessions, chatting in community meetings, or out in the woods during a forest school session with children. But there are also conversations at the school gate, during a walk, meal times, supermarket chance meetings, chatting and nattering, maybe even whining and whinging. People like to share information and discuss the information, debating, arguing points of view. Being able to be a trusted part of those everyday conversations is the really important part of communication. And in the project, we wanted to take consultation past that point to conversation. where we were part of the process, involved in the communication rather than directing it from outside. So, Earth Stories, that's what we called it. Once upon a time in a land far, far away. That's that same opening line, but in the story, in the fairy story way of saying it rather than the Star Wars version. So that might be how we think stories should start, but I much prefer ones that start, you'll never guess what happened yesterday on the allotment, or when we arrived in the UK last year, we couldn't believe how green it was. Because although there are some amazing and exciting stories of going on bear hunts, tigers who want to come to tea, or unrequited love, the stories that people tell each other every day are the stories that I love. I love hearing the chit chat and the natter. When a colleague phones me to tell me about what happened to her the other day at Strawberry Fields Park, the couple who always walk round together, they waved at me today. It was lovely they recognised me. When we're out in parks, we get to hear everyone's stories. Now we can be together again. We can make time to stop, chat, and now perhaps this is actually more important than ever. Oh, and I know there are amazing storytellers out there everywhere, not just in parks. You see, stories know no boundaries. They flow out from one person to another with no care of who is telling the story, who is listening, and actually, if anybody's listening. And if language is a barrier, it doesn't matter because pictures, gestures, dance, and music fill the gaps and jump those barriers. Stories will not be contained. They find a way to break through, to be seen, to be heard. They can bubble out with excitement or pour out with a sadness, sinking to the floor with sorrow, but they will not stay untold. So because the Naturally Birmingham project was making plans for Birmingham's parks and green spaces and the environment we live in, we wanted communities to help us find out what those plans should include by telling us their stories. We also want to show people who make the decisions about parks and green spaces and our environment how important those green spaces are to everyone, all cultures, all ages, every single person in Birmingham, over 1 million people, every one of us has a story. We really need to still have those stories. And this year, it's all about you, including you who are listening now, whoever you are. Each and every story is so important. We want to hear them all. Without you telling us, we may not know. We want to publish your stories as blogs or vlogs, so you could write them or send them a picture. If it's music you express yourself through, songs, dance, poetry, we don't care. We want you to change our point of view, enrich how we currently see green spaces through the stories of parks in Birmingham. We want them to be diverse and different. It should have equity, empathy, and harmony. And that's hard for us to achieve without hearing all of your stories and weaving them into the fabric that will make it real. This is about you listening now and anybody else who we can reach in Birmingham. We still want to hear your stories. So we received pictures that tell a story from the children that were involved in the project. All sorts of different pictures. Here's just a few. I really like the fact that rainbow colours often were very common theme through the pictures. And I'm hoping that that's about hope, about inclusion, about diversity. And there are also, we accepted the negative messages as well because we see those as just as important. So, you know, litter and glass, we don't want plastics. But the picture on the right as well, that picture that's not quite there, it's quite a haunting picture. And I haven't asked for an explanation of it. Every story is what it is. But quite a few of us found that a really interesting way of somebody communicating green space to us. So there's a wide range of stories, even through a few images. Short stories. So some of them, as I say, were just a couple of lines long. There's one in the middle here. The first memories of using the parks or green spaces was when I was very young. I could probably remember at the age of 6, we would always go to the parks at the weekend, do nature walks, pick up acorns and twigs, generally play in the playgrounds, and even visit the ducks and have picnics with the family. I think it's very important that today we still use our green spaces and parks for that. That fact. It's good for children to socialise outside, and it's quite good for families to come together and actually spend time away from technology and spend more time in nature. None of the words have been altered. Not everybody is a brilliant writer or storyteller. It is just wonderful that they have shared their experiences with us. And it's just at this moment that I've realised that I didn't click a box that I should have clicked. So I'm going to come back to the last story at the end, and hopefully I can share that with you. I'm going to carry on through. So if a picture can paint 1,000 words, what can a storyteller do? And we'll continue to think about that, and I'll come back to it. So this was a story that we received, and I have got a recording of the person saying it, but I didn't tick the box that I should have ticked. But these were, I thought it was really interesting words because of the story that it tells of, because before lockdown happened in March 2020, I used to enjoy going out for food or shopping, attending events in Birmingham and travelling out of town to see friends and family. I think that because of lockdown rules and having to stay inside a lot, people felt like they were out of sync. And I was definitely one of those people. It was a good thing and a bad thing because it enabled me to reflect and look back at myself and look at what I do, but also made me do new things. And one of the interesting things that have come out from these stories, obviously, the time we asked for them, a lot of them relate to experiences through COVID and the fact that people connected with nature at a time at which they were really looking for solace, for peace, for exercise, for purpose. And it increased the number of people that were accessing green spaces. And this is really interesting. Because he says here, something that I definitely enjoy doing now that I didn't do much before is going for walks. There's a huge park by my house and it's called Sutton Park. I recently found out it's one of the biggest parks in Europe. The young man who was telling this story didn't even know the park was there before COVID. It takes up massive park. It takes up most of Sutton Coldfield. But it wasn't until there was a need for him to connect that he connected. And when we asked him, he could tell us that story. And it was one of the most interesting stories because it did go from before, told us the bit in the middle, and it actually goes on to tell us his hopes for the future and what he's planning to do in the future. So videos, poems, and longer stories. So I hope you don't mind me telling you another story that came in or reading it out to you. My earliest memories of playing at home were indoors or out in the yard at the back of the shop. We lived on the edge of Sheffield city centre in a shop on the main road. My walk to nursery led you to a side of the road with a railway and steelworks at the end of it. So this was all very gritty, very urban. At weekends, we quite often went to our grandparents'. They lived there at opposite sides of town, so it was always involved a long bus ride and walk. And I always looked forward to staying at my mum's parents', but really didn't like going to my dad's parents'. They were really strict and there was nowhere to play. And it also meant sleeping in their attic, which was completely undecorated and unfurnished. So as a child was really scary. My granddad on my father's side was a steel worker. So he worked on Saturday mornings. We were always waiting for him to come home and we'd all enjoy lunch together. I remember this one day, I would have been about 4 years old. It was sunny outside, but we hadn't been allowed to play outside in the morning. So after lunch, my granddad suggested taking me to his allotment. I suspect because I was becoming troublesome, my sister stayed back to do things with Grandma. It wasn't a long walk from my granddad's house, but we first arrived at the park, so I thought he'd changed his mind. When I didn't know there was allotments hidden in the park, I had never been before, so I didn't know what to expect. We entered a gate into a magical kingdom where everything was taller than me. Real Jack in the Beanstalks, really tall, and giant rhubarb. I didn't know what any of this was until my grandpa told me. I felt like being in a maze with narrow paths turning this way and that, with the sun beating down from above. Then he said we'd reached his garden, which was a wooden glass house. I had never seen one before. When he opened the door, all of my senses were completely overwhelmed. The smell was fantastic. Wow, it was warm in there. Everything was up on the benches, so towering over me below. All along the benches were huge pansies, the sort with smiley faces, such colours and sweet, sweet scents. I still love them to this day. Each one had a different face as big as mine, so I smiled back at them all in turn. And then my grandpa picked a golden tomato. It was warm and glowing like the sun, but slightly rough to the touch. What do I do with this, Grandad? I asked. Just pop it in your mouth, he said. It was so sweet and totally delicious. I started to cry. Whatever's the matter? He asked. I don't want to go home, I said. I just want to stay here forever. I had found my paradise. At the age of 4, a garden, pure and simple. I fell in love with plants and gardening from that day on. When my granddad retired, he took up gardening just like his father. He tried to grow exotic flowers and melons, and this became a real bond between us, which was a good thing. As when I was 18, I found out why I had to go almost every weekend to my grandparents, and I didn't have any memories of my dad in those days. Now, that was a story from a member of our team, and he'd never spoken to us like this. It had always been very business, and we hadn't had an insight. So we each shared a story similar to this within the team. And suddenly, our whole understanding of the people that we worked with completely changed. And we understood why all of us were where we were today. And you can read the rest of that story on our blog, and you've got the link there, which we'll send out to you. Okay. So I want to leave enough time to be able to hopefully have a bit of discussion or tell you a little bit more about the Earth Stories project. But I did promise you at the beginning that we'd have a children's story, and I do really enjoy more than anything really telling stories to children, watching their faces. And on one occasion, when I was with the teeny explorers who are under 5s out at the Lickey Hills, I was telling a story about a dragon. They were helping me tell the story and adding in little bits and pieces of the story as well. And it's all very dramatic. And when you're out in the woods, magic can actually happen. And I can remember getting to a point in the story where the dragon was soaring overhead. And as I described it and pointed up to where the dragon would be, all of the children looked up to the sky. And for a moment, I actually thought I could see the dragon as well. The power of storytelling is really, really strong. And here's a story that I wrote. It's a very short story. And I got the chance to live stream it on Facebook during some storytelling sessions that I did during lockdown. And I wasn't aware at the time, because my husband holds the camera for me when I'm doing live streams, that around 4,000 people were watching. It is an incredibly powerful way to transmit a message. That's one of the most important things that I want you to take from this. Okay, so are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Archie was a dinosaur. He did not stomp. He did not roar. His neck was thick, not very long. His legs were slim, not big and strong. His tail was wide, not long and thin. He had no horn or spikes or fin. He was short, not very tall, not like a dinosaur at all. He asked his mom if she was sure that he was a dinosaur. She smiled at him and called out, "Caw! Oh, yes, you are a dinosaur. Your neck is short, not very long. Your legs are slim, not big and strong. Your tail is wide, not long and thin. You have no horn or spikes or fin. But you have feathers to help you fly. Flap your wings, give it a try. Then hop and jump and screeching cry, woo! Off you soar into the sky. Now you're back down on the floor. Let me say, so you are sure, yes, you are a dinosaur. You and all my little chicks are all called Archaeopteryx. You do not stomp, you do not roar, but yes, you are a dinosaur. Now, there's lots of messages in that story, and there's a message perhaps about being confident, even if you don't fit in with other people, that you are special in your own way and you're not alone. Sometimes stories are just told for fun, sometimes for entertainment, but most stories transmit a message to other people. And that is the power of communication and engagement. And there's a few things that you can think about if you want to use storytelling, or if perhaps you're thinking of writing stories yourself for whoever that audience is, even if it's only for yourself. A central character is really good. Now, you can tell stories about yourself, but if you are trying to appeal to people other than yourself, you need to think about those worlds that they live in. Do they see life differently? Do they have a different point of view? And be able to put yourself into their world. The easiest way to find out about other people's worlds, like we did, is to ask for people's stories so that you get to understand the things that bother them, the things that make them happy, and the things that make them who they are. You need a beginning, which could be the end. You need something memorable. That story rhymes. Is it a poem? Is it a story? The Greeks used poetry to rhyme their stories to make them more memorable, so that when they told them person to person, they could remember the stories. A character, a theme, make it memorable. Make the ending as important as the beginning. And in that story, that children's story, I actually used tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. So all of the classic ways of presenting, or things that we call talks, we've got TED Talks. TED Talks are so fascinating. If you've ever seen them, if you haven't, Google it and listen to some TED Talks. They're not talks, they're stories. People tell stories, and that's what keeps people captivated and makes them memorable. Okay, so I've got some ideas here for how you can get engaged. So you can tell us your Earth story. You can send it me by email. If you've got something welling up inside you now that you want to get out, send it me straight away. You can read the blogs on the Naturally Birmingham website. You can read the newsletter, because although it's a newsletter, it still has stories within it. Some of the bits are really factual, but there is always one bit that's a story. Read a book, better still, read a book to somebody else. Spread the word, make some time to stop and chat. Host a storytelling session with your colleagues. Do this. It's brilliant. You get to learn to know each other. It's fantastic. Have a go at writing a poem. It doesn't have to rhyme. If you can't write a poem, draw a picture. Write a story. Join a storytelling class, because there's a lot to learn, but the very first thing you need to do is just get your story out there. That's the really important part. Now I've got a little bit of time left, because I would just love, I'm just going to stop sharing and hopefully get all that sorted out so it actually stops sharing. Has that stopped sharing, Sam?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Right. Fantastic. Okay. So hopefully you will have been inspired, maybe a bit entertained, hopefully. What I would like to do is have even just one person be willing to share a short story with us. That would be absolutely amazing. Anybody willing to share? I think just turn your mic on and tell us something that happened.
Nobody's got the confidence of you, Debbie. No,
come on.
We can't live up to that wonderful storytelling.
How about this morning? What happened on the way to the forum? We're not going very far, are we, at the moment? Some of us are going into the office. Has anybody? I mean, Sam, I know your internet was down. Tell us about what that impact that had on you.
The internet is still down, Debbie. So I'm sitting here working for the Birmingham Children's Trust today at Teamworks Go-Karting for children of Birmingham to be included in activities throughout the school holidays, which is ramming here. There's lots of children all about enjoying the go-karting, the laser tag, face painting, crafts and everything like that. So but yeah, the internet's down. I'm in the office and I'm sitting here on my phone listening to your wonderful stories, Debbie.
The power of communication. There's always some way we can connect. They can't stop us. They can't stop us.
And I even set up a meeting for us on my phone, didn't I, earlier?
You did, and that was the best bit of the story for me. You solved my problem, which was absolutely fantastic. Any other stories, questions? I want to hear your voices as well. That's what this session is all about. Somebody needs to be brave enough. Are you still there?
Yes.
It just shows us how unconfident and how what's the word I'm looking for, Deb? I'm trying not it to be me, because it's always me and you, Debbie and Sam. So I'm trying to give other people a session, but it just shows you that when we come away from childhood and we do all that talking as a child, we've got no inhibitions, have we? We talk to people, we speak to them, we ask what they're doing, we start telling stories, and look what happens when we get to adulthood. The moment you offer people the space to do that, we're so not used to it. And I don't want to bang on about technology, because I do think that's got a lot to do with it. But it stuns us into silence, because our adult brain is now thinking, oh, I can't possibly compete. She's done it so well. And what am I going to sound like? And this, that, and the other. So, part of this wonder, I mean, to be honest, I'm mesmerised, Debbie. You've taken me away from duty, and I'm just mesmerised. It's amazing. But, isn't it a shame that we we lose that childlike approach to just being ourselves and speaking out. So I do get it, folks. Please don't think I'm being critical, but it just shows us, those of us that work in early years, this is what happens. There's a skill, isn't there? There's a confidence. There's an ability to be. Debbie and I and Sam, I'm sure, we have no trouble being childlike because it's what we do. But Stephen, go on.
I'd argue it's not that we lose that childlike confidence or storytelling. It is removed from us. It is beaten out of us. Literally, in people of my generation, I'm 52. We go to school, shut up, be quiet, listen. We go to work, shut up, be quiet, listen.
Well, see, that was a very, very short story, but I am going to be completely honest with you. That moved me to tears. So it is that moment when we share something like that, where the emotions and the imagination and all those things, like you say, we're not allowed. We feel like we're not allowed to. And Paul, you said, but for some reason, I can't see the chat. This is one of the sort of things that happens with technology. I did see it pop up, but then I lost it, Paul. You made a comment. Oh, there we go. It's working now. Fear kicks in as you get older. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, definitely. You, in work sometimes it's you have to almost like conform. If everyone else is quiet, it's like this sort of ring of fear kicks in.
It's fascinating. I'm so glad you're sharing because it is fascinating, Sam.
I think, Debbie, as well, thinking about storytelling and your own imagination, it's probably the fear of people thinking that you're absolutely crazy as well. You know, like when you spend, it does tickle me when you talk about the dragon story, and you know, I know we've been up the Lickey Hills and some of the stories that you've told me that you spoke about with the little green champions. I've actually thought, wow, her imagination is wild. and I think sometimes people, you know, to go out of your zone with that imagination, people, you've probably got that fear that sometimes people might think you're a little bit crazy.
You're absolutely right, Sam, and I do, you know, I am actually, so don't think I don't have any fear, by the way, because I am frightened, and I'm LeVar Burton, I think his name is, from Star Trek Next Generation, who plays Geordie LaForge. He actually does story reading and storytelling on the internet, and he says himself, he's appeared in all sorts of things, frightened to death every time he starts the session, but the starting is the hump you have to get over. Once you start sharing and talking, it all flows out. And this is why I am encouraging you. I wish I could instruct you. I wish I could give you permission, but I can't. So I can only encourage you to arrange storytelling sessions, story sharing. It's probably sometimes a better way to say it, with your colleagues, and get used to doing it. Because just as Kay said, and I'll bring you back in, Kay, in a second, but as Kay said, it's like we are all, and Paul and everybody said, we're scared to do it. If we normalize it, then we get to understand it. Then we can communicate better outside with communities as well. And that's the really important bit. Kay?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to respond to Stephen because I felt really sad as well. And I do take your point, Stephen, entirely. I mean, you know, we're very lucky that I particularly, and Debbie and Sam, we work with children in early years, and it's almost, it's accepted before they get to school. And it takes a very creative and, you know, sort of old school sort of head teacher to lead a school that allows literacy to be on the top, because we've become so IT dependent, and we push. I'm just thinking of like Pink Floyd and The Wall as I'm speaking about it. I don't know whether you've ever seen it, Stephen. You know, we don't need no education.
Yes,
It's
more
like
than enough to have seen it.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, and it is this almost systematic. If you know, we need to learn about IT, we need to put them in front of computers, and we really need to get back to the creative arts in schools and teaching, don't we? Where we actually encourage our children to be zany and to be using literacy and maths and music in a completely different way. So I do take your point, Stephen. I think there's a lot of work to be done. We're just very, very excitable in early years because, like Sam and Debbie have said, we've almost got permission, and the more childlike we are, the more we excite each other. So you know, it is a bit of a sad reflection on society, but we just don't want to give in to it, do we? We want to keep going and encouraging people as much as they can to try and do it. So whatever you can do in your own little way, Stephen, I take your point totally, but yeah, I don't know. I'm waffling now, you see. I can't stop once I start, but I'm going to shut up a minute.
That it's all good.
I think as well, storytelling isn't just about, you know, your imagination and, you know, storytelling about your experiences, your memories as well, you know, things that have happened are good to share as well, you know, to get to know people.
It's as I say, this might be able to tell this is a subject really close to my heart, and as I said, I believe, you know, it's my purpose, my destiny, to be honest. But what's really interesting, Sam, is when one person tells another person a factual story, the other person, the listener, has to engage their imagination in order to see the story. So what happens is you hear a story, but your brain kind of paints in the image, you know. So even though we can't see each other, if you describe something, your brain starts to create an image of it, and it is so fascinating. It's an endless subject, but even in, you know, if somebody just says some facts to you, and you've probably seen this on the, you know, there's a television program about improving your memory. It's happened lots of times. They use this storytelling technique. So they link a list of things with a story because it's easier to remember a story. Now, story, you might be able to remember. Poem, even easier. Song, lots of people can sing a song with all the lyrics right, but they wouldn't be able to repeat a list of 10 items to you. There's a whole lot of interesting psychology going on around storytelling that you can go off and you can Google, and you can get lost in the world of what telling each other stories is about, factual, you know, imaginary, and how many stories that are told are actually very similar. And as I said, across the world, similar storytelling techniques come out. It binds us together as humanity. And to have it suppressed, Stephen, like you said, suppresses part of our humanity and stops a really important processes happening around mental health, as well as just enjoyment and engagement and communication. So that's where I'm going to leave my talking. I'm loving the, yes, oh gosh, yeah, Jackanory. They've been doing some Jackanory videos with unusual people telling stories that have really captivated adults, and I have to say in some cases ladies particularly, depending on who's telling the story. But Jackanory, absolutely brilliant. Use Jackanory, let's say, because the other thing I would say is, if you want to get into storytelling because you're finding this fascinating, but you're frightened, read a book to each other, because it actually helps you to learn to vocalize things. So just read. So I used to work at the Nature Centre, and there was 4 of us, and we, in the afternoon, just as we were closing, we couldn't do much because we had to be around, but we weren't having to do anything particular. We used to pick one of the children's books and take turns reading it to each other. It's a really useful way to build that skill of doing that. So 2 minutes before the end, you could go away for 2 minutes now. You could find a book. You could tell somebody next to you a story, tap them on the shoulder and say, guess what? I'm going to tell you my story. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you get out there and tell stories. Look for the Naturally Birmingham website, share them with us, and we'll share them wider. And just thank you all for being here. Do have a read of the chat, because there's some interesting things going in there as well. Well done, everybody. Thank you for being a receptive audience, I hope, and get out there and tell those stories.
Thank you, Debbie.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much for everybody who puts it on. Thanks, Debbie. Can we have this on a regular monthly basis, please? Be fabulous.
We'll find a space for it for those that want to join. We'll find somewhere.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.